Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at our last branch of government. That is the judicial branch. You want to match up judicial with judges or justices, the people that sit on the courts. So now we've got our executive done, we got our legislative done, and now we are focused on the court system. Those are your Supreme Courts and your national courts. The number one job of a judicial branch is to, of course, interpret the law. This is the idea of applying the law based on some kind of constitution, as is here in the United States, on a religion, or some kind of party norm if you are a different country in a different part of government. Number two, the idea of judicial review when you're talking about a judicial branch of a democratic system. This is where the court can overturn legislation or block executive action. Judicial review is important to a democratic norm that makes sure that democratic governments function effectively and it prevents abuse of power from the other branches of government. Of course, our primary understanding for a judicial branch to work in a democratic government, the judicial must be independent. It must be able to rule, to overturn legislative branch edicts, and to block executive actions. If you don't have an independent judiciary, you don't have a democracy. The judicial branch must be independent. Now, what does it mean for a judicial branch to be independent? Well, let's take a look at what it takes in terms of judges. Number one, are judges qualified? Are you just simply appointing them based on the politics, or are they actually qualified judges? So you get things like court packing is a common term, where Franklin Roosevelt attempted to do this. This was discussed when Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett were put on the Supreme Court by President Trump. Uh, that we have currently 9 justices on the court. It skews now conservative. Well, how if a Democrat takes power, all of a sudden they expand the number of court seats from 9 justices to 13 justices, and then put in people that they think are qualified. If it's done as a political appointment, you don't really have much of an independent judicial branch. So that court packing kind of thing, by appointing people that more agree with you, that's an example of a non-independence. You need them to be qualified. Number two, do judges have term limits? And this is kind of, tough. You can't have them short term. If a justice is done by short termism, or if they're done by elections, then they're going to be held accountable to the people in terms of their politics, and not the whatever the Constitution is actually saying or what the law actually is. But having a justice go too long, and it'll be really difficult to get rid of them if they start making illiberal decisions or super politically motivated decisions. So we're looking at what is the best in terms of term limits for judges. The United States has intentionally done as a lifetime judicial appointment, and that was Alexander Hamilton saying, "Well, then you're not going to have judges that are going to be pandering to politics." Can you remove a justice? What's the process of removing them? If it's easy to remove them, then it really defeats the purpose of having an independent judicial branch, because they'll simply get removed by either branch of government or by some kind of process of election. If it's difficult to remove them, too difficult, then a justice may be able to abuse power in some way. And then, of course, number one on the list, can they actually overrule the legislative and executive? If they can't do that, they're not independent, but they must have the authority to overrule both other branches of government and not be overly influenced by them. Okay. There are two types of law when we're dealing with government. One is common law. This is where the basis of the law is in tradition, past practices, and legal precedents. And usually, this is the kind of law that you get that goes through a lot of the court systems. Okay, we don't have a law that says you can do X, but we have a court case that says you can do X. So therefore, that law is valid. Okay, this is common law. Coded law is obviously your written law, where you say, "Oh, you broke the law," or "the law says you can do this or can't do this." So courts rule on both of these, but when you're talking about precedents from past court cases, that's the idea of common law. So let's talk about the judicial branches, and if they have judicial review, obviously the Parliament appoints the UK Supreme Court. It does have rule of law as opposed to rule by law. It has both common and coded law bases, and it is a legitimate location. It's a legitimate function for judicial review. Mexico has the Mexican Supreme Court. It is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Mexican Senate. It does run under rule of law, and its core legal basis is the Mexican Constitution. Does it have judicial review? It does, but it's really weak. It can prevent some executive authority, but overall, the executive branch is the strongest of the three branches in Mexico. Judicial review does exist, but it is pretty weak. Nigeria has the Nigerian Supreme Court. It is nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Now, the basis of the national law is rule of law, and the basis being the Constitution. But when you get from the middle belt of the country north, you start having Sharia law. It doesn't overwhelm constitutional laws in Nigeria, but it is local and regional laws, and sometimes those norms conflict with the Constitution. Sharia being, of course, fundamentalist Islamic law. So it becomes rule by law, where the local governments will often use Sharia as a way to get people to conform and behave in a certain way. Is there judicial review in Nigeria in terms of constitutional law? There is, but again, very, very weak. We have the Russian Supreme Court and the constitutional courts of Russia. They are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Federation Council, which of course is put in by governors, which are of course selected by the president. It is a rule by law court system that is insanely corrupt. The core legal basis is the Constitution. Of course, the reality is they follow Vladimir Putin. Is there judicial review in Russia? Well, in theory, there's supposed to be, but in practice, it does not happen at all. In Iran, we have the Iranian Supreme Court. It is headed by the judicial chief that is appointed by the supreme leader. It is clearly ruled by law. Its core legal basis is Sharia law, Islam. But is there judicial review? Well, if you count Sharia law. So it's held accountable to that. And then in China, you have the Supreme Court of the People's Republic of China. Its appointment is done by the Chinese Communist Party. It is clearly ruled by law. Its core legal basis is the Communist Party's doctrine. At this point, the Communist Party is Xi Jinping, so it's essentially him that is going to be the Communist Party doctrine. Is there any kind of judicial review in China? The answer is no. So when we look at judicial review, it's very clear in the UK. It does exist in Mexico and Nigeria, but it is very weak. Russia, Iran, China, there's really no judicial review to push back on at all. And remember, the democratic state, you must have judicial independence for it to be considered a legitimate judicial independent branch.